You're standing in your kitchen at 6:50 on a Wednesday morning, waiting for the toaster to finish its second cycle because the first slice came out pale, when the lawyer's email arrives with a subject line that reads simply, "Revised terms. Please advise." You already know what's inside before you open it. 2 weeks of back and forth, 3 red lines, and a media company willing to pay $2.1 million for the rights to your story. The whistleblower case you'd quietly won 18 months earlier. The one that had already settled, already closed, already faded out of the news cycle for everyone except the handful of people still writing to ask when the documentary was coming. The new terms include your name. Not a pseudonym this time, not a silhouette interview shot from behind with your voice altered, the way the 2 previous smaller offers had proposed. Full name, full face, a producer's note about how authenticity drives engagement in the current media landscape. You read the email twice, standing at the counter, and the toaster finishes its cycle behind you. You eat the toast. You reply to the lawyer with 4 words, "I'll pass. Thank you." Then you go to work. Thinks years, where almost nobody knows what you did before you started there. Nobody throws a parade for turning down $2 million. There is no applause for the version of the story that never gets told. The email just sits there afterward, answered, closed, and everything continues exactly the way it did the day before. The levels don't feel like levels when you're inside them. Everything eventually just becomes Wednesday. Your former colleague Nathaniel took a different deal 2 years earlier, in a case with a similar shape but a smaller number attached. $340,000 for the rights to his story. His name and face included, a segment on a major network that ran for 11 minutes and generated, by his own count, 43 unsolicited messages in the first week alone. He announced it before the segment had even aired, a post with a photo of himself outside the network's building, a caption about finally being able to tell the truth. Within a month, there was a new condo downtown, a leased sedan replacing the sensible one he'd driven for a decade, and a habit of mentioning the segment in conversations that had nothing to do with it, the way people work a reference into small talk when they've started to measure a room's reaction to hearing it. Nathaniel financed the condo with a mortgage sized to the assumption that more media opportunities would follow the first one, a second book deal or a speaking circuit, or some ongoing relationship with the network that never quite materialized past a single follow-up call 8 months later that went nowhere. He tells you this over coffee, unprompted, the way people tell you things they've rehearsed the explanation for. He says the segment was basically an investment in the next chapter, which is a sentence people only say about a next chapter that hasn't actually been written yet. The condo costs $2,900 a month. Against his actual income, which reverted to an ordinary salary within a year of the segment airing, that condo isn't dollars. It's roughly a full week of his life every single month, spent servicing a mortgage head sized to a version of fame that turned out to last exactly 11 minutes and 43 messages, most of which, he eventually admits, were strangers asking him to help with their own unrelated legal problems, as though the segment had made him a lawyer rather than simply a person something had once happened to. He calls the network deal the moment everything opened up. Nothing opened up, not structurally. The messages stopped within 2 months, the follow-up call led nowhere, and the only lasting change to his life was a mortgage payment sized to an income spike that had already ended by the time the first payment came due. He is, by any honest measure, more exposed now than he was before the segment aired. His name searchable forever alongside the case, his face recognizable to strangers in a way that occasionally still surfaces at inconvenient moments. A grocery store, a parent-teacher conference, a first date that ended early once the other person put the name together with the story. This is the first quiet truth underneath everything that follows. The loud version of the story and the safe version are almost never compatible with each other. Nathaniel needed the segment to say something about him before anyone had to ask. You've never once needed $2 million to do that work on your behalf, and turning it down was to sacrifice exactly. It was closer to declining a trade that only ever looked profitable from a distance. At the same coffee, Nathaniel asks whether you ever regret not taking one of the offers that came your way, and you tell him not really. He looks at you the way people look at an answer they've already decided not to fully believe, and changes the subject to the segment's anniversary, which is apparently something he still tracks. He has no idea the $2.1 million offer existed at all, let alone that it was turned down 4 days before this exact conversation. You don't mention it. Mentioning it was never going to make either of you feel better about the coffee. Neither of you is a bad person, and it would be easy for this to sound like contempt, which isn't the intention. Nathaniel is doing something almost everyone in his position is quietly encouraged to do, treating a moment of public attention as a resource to be captured before it disappears, the way a business captures a spike in traffic before the algorithm moves on to someone else. He wanted the segment, the condo, the messages from strangers, to arrive at a conclusion about him before anyone had to do the work of asking whether the story's value was actually meant to be spent that way. You've never once needed a segment to do that work on your behalf, and it isn't a virtue exactly, more a byproduct of watching, in the months right after the case first closed, exactly how quickly public attention arrives and how much more quickly it leaves once the next story comes along to replace it. The Sunday after the lawyer's email, you sit at the same kitchen table you've sat at for 6 years, with the same laptop, the toaster from Wednesday morning still sitting on the counter with a faint burnt smell that never quite goes away, no matter how many times you clean it. You do exactly what you did the Sunday before the offer arrived. You open a spreadsheet. You go through every recurring charge across every account. The same 11 to 18-minute ritual it's always been, regardless of the 7-figure number that briefly existed and then didn't. You find a $4.99 charge for a cloud storage upgrade you no longer need. Back down under the free tier now that you've deleted the photos from a trip 2 years ago you never got around to organizing. You cancel it. $5 means functionally nothing against $2 million turned down 4 days earlier. You cancel it anyway because the habit was never really about the $5. It's about never being the last person in the room to notice something's gone quietly wrong. And that discipline doesn't get to take a week off just because a number that large briefly passed through your life and then didn't stay. You keep moving the same fixed, boring percentage of every paycheck into the same accounts you funded this way for 6 years, the exact modest sums that have nothing to do with what the media deal might have added. The settlement from the original case, the one that actually closed 18 months earlier, sits where it's always sat, invested conservatively, generating enough to matter, but nowhere close to enough to explain the ordinary Civic in the driveway or the 6-year-old couch in the living room. Nothing about the routine changes because a much larger number briefly hovered nearby and then didn't land. Your sister calls that same Sunday, the only person besides your lawyer who knows the offer existed at all, and she asks, not for the first time, whether you're certain you made the right call. You tell her you are. She mentions that $2, $1 million could have paid off her own mortgage twice over with room to spare, said gently, not as pressure, just as the plain arithmetic of what the number could have meant for people who weren't you. You tell her you understand the arithmetic. You made the call anyway because the arithmetic was never the part that mattered most. What she doesn't fully see, and what took you 18 months of living quietly after the case closed to fully absorb, is that the 18 minutes on a Sunday were never really about the $5 charge. They're about staying the kind of person who checks, who notices the small drift before it becomes the large one, whether that drift is a forgotten subscription or the much larger drift of a life reorganized around a story instead of a person, the way Nathaniel's had. The $2 million wasn't a single dramatic decision made in isolation. It was 6 years of a specific kind of ordinary, and no number, however large, was ever going to be worth trading that ordinary away for 11 minutes and 43 messages. 8 months after turning down the offer, a journalist working on an unrelated story stumbles across your name in a set of court records that were never supposed to be widely searchable, connects it to the original case, and reaches out with a set of pointed questions that make clear she already has most of the shape of the story, with or without your cooperation. This is the moment the anonymity you turned down $2 million to protect gets tested for real, not as a hypothetical, but as an actual Thursday afternoon with a journalist's email sitting open on your screen and a deadline she's given you of 5 business days to respond before she publishes with or without a comment from you. You call your lawyer confirms what you'd already suspected. There is no legal mechanism to stop a journalist from reporting information she's legitimately obtained through public records, no matter how you feel about how she found it. The only real leverage you have is the same leverage you've always had, the option to shape the story by participating in it, or the option to stay silent and let it run without your voice in it at all. Same storm, entirely different stakes than the ones the media company had originally offered to manage on your behalf for $2.1 million. The habit that made the difference in this stretch isn't dramatic in the slightest. Because you'd never built a life that depended on the story staying hidden. No mortgage-sized to a fame that hadn't arrived yet. No income stream that assumed continued attention. No identity publicly reorganized around what had happened to you. The journalist's email, while unwelcome, didn't threaten to collapse anything structural. You'd built your actual security on the boring stuff, The Sunday spreadsheet, the settlement invested conservatively and left alone. The 6-year job where almost nobody knew the story at all. The story becoming public against your wishes would be unpleasant. It would not be financially catastrophic because nothing in your financial life had ever been built on the assumption that it would stay private forever. The surprise has a comma in it. But a system was already standing there, waiting, built quietly in the 18 months before the journalist's email had any reason to exist. You give her a brief, careful statement, confirming the basic facts without elaborating, and the story runs 4 days later as a minor part of a larger piece, generating almost no attention on its own. Nathaniel texts you a link to it that same week, apparently having set up an alert for your name at some point without ever mentioning it, asking if you're doing okay. You tell him you are. You are. There is a woman named Corinne who handles intake at the legal aid clinic where you'd first gotten connected to the attorney who worked your original case, someone you have stayed loosely in touch with over the years, mostly through an annual holiday card and the occasional coffee when schedules align. Corinne mentions, almost in passing during one of these coffees, that Shed had a case of her own once, decades earlier, a workplace situation similar in shape to yours, though smaller in scale, that had also come with an offer from a regional outlet interested in her story. A much smaller number, 4 figures rather than 7, but a real offer nonetheless, back before the internet made every published name permanently searchable in the way it does now. She turned it down too, she says, for reasons she'd never fully articulated to anyone until this exact conversation, decades later, over coffee she's paying for, despite your attempt to grab the check. She says the case had already given her more attention than Shed ever wanted, colleagues treating her differently, a promotion that came through suspiciously soon afterward that she's never been fully able to trust the motives behind, and the idea of inviting more of that attention on purpose, for money, felt like it would cost her something the number couldn't replace. That's the quiet truth underneath everything Corinne has ever done since, and it's the same one Nathaniel never quite learned. Some kinds of exposure, once accepted, don't reverse, no matter how the money that came with them gets spent or saved afterward. Anonymity isn't a product you can buy back once you've sold it. It's closer to a resource that only exists in its unspent form, and the moment it's spent, every subsequent decision about your life gets made with an audience already assumed into the room. She tells you one more thing before the coffee ends, almost as an afterthought, the same unhurried way she used to schedule intake appointments back when you first met her. She says nobody at the clinic knows about her own case decades later, not because it's a secret exactly, but because it simply never came up in a way that made sense to mention. The same way she's never once brought up the 4-figure offer she turned down unless someone happens to ask the exact right question at the exact right coffee. Your father calls at 7:15 on a Friday evening, an hour that isn't unusual on its own, except for the specific weight in his voice the moment you pick up. Your mother's had a scare. Chest pains that turned out, after several tense hours at the hospital, to be something manageable but serious enough that the cardiologist wants a follow-up procedure within the month, one that isn't fully covered and comes with a bill large enough that your father mentions it almost apologetically, the way people mention costs they're embarrassed to be thinking about during a moment that should be entirely about relief. You tell him you'll cover whatever the insurance doesn't. You do not open the settlement account first to check the exact number. You do not run the mental math about what the $2.1 million might have made this decision look like, an easier, more generous, more comfortable version of the same gesture. The cost simply doesn't attend the moment. It isn't in the room with you at all, not even as a passing shadow, not even as the ghost of a number you once turned away. This is the truth every other decision in this story was quietly building toward, and it's the only one that isn't really about money or anonymity at any point. It's about what staying quiet was actually for the entire time, underneath the Sunday spreadsheets, and the 6-year job, and the journalist's email you handled without letting it become a bigger story than it needed to be. Not Nathaniel's condo, not the 43 messages that stopped after 2 months, not even Corinne's decades of never mentioning her own smaller version of the same decision. It was always, from the moment you first said no to the lawyer 4 days after the revised terms arrived, about purchasing your own absence from a spotlight, so that when your father's voice cracks slightly on the phone at 7:15 on a Friday, your full, unmortgaged attention belongs entirely to your parents, and to nothing else competing for the same 11 seconds. Not a producer's follow-up call, not a stranger recognizing you at the pharmacy, not a version of your life reorganized around a story instead of a family. That's the highest job the decision ever does, and almost nobody markets it that way because it doesn't photograph well, and it doesn't fit into a segment that runs 11 minutes on a major network. It doesn't buy a condo or a leased sedan or the particular temporary warmth of 43 strangers reaching out to say they saw you on television. It buys the silence in which the only thing that actually matters that evening, your mother, stable, frightened but stable, a manageable procedure ahead rather than an emergency, can be heard without a single other thing competing for the same attention. You drive to the hospital that night. Your father is in a chair too small for him in a hallway that smells like antiseptic and old coffee, and he doesn't ask you a single question about the bill beyond the practical logistics of when the procedure's scheduled, because it's never once occurred to him that money might be the thing standing between his wife and the care she needs. That absence, the fact that the deeper question never even arrives in the room, is the entire architecture of a decision made 8 months earlier over a toaster that ran 2 cycles, made visible for the first time in a hallway neither of you expected to be standing in that particular Friday. You get home that night, well past midnight, and the toaster is still sitting on the counter with the same faint burnt smell, exactly where it sat the Wednesday the lawyer's email arrived. You make yourself a slice of toast anyway, standing at the counter the way you have most nights for 6 years. And while it toasts you, check your email out of habit. The same reflexive Sunday-adjacent gesture it's always been, even on a Friday, well past midnight. There's a new message from the lawyer, sent hours earlier, unrelated to anything from 8 months ago. A routine update on an entirely different matter, nothing urgent, the kind of email that would have felt significant once and now barely registers. You read it, reply briefly, and go back to the toast. Money never fixes a Friday evening. It never fixed the crack in your father's voice before you'd said a single word back to him, and it wouldn't have arrived any faster if the $2.1 million had been sitting in your account instead of a settlement you've kept quietly invested for 18 months. It would have changed nothing about the chest pains that already happened or the procedure already scheduled. Money doesn't undo the things that already occurred. It only decides quietly in years in advance whether the next hard Friday costs you a phone call full of arithmetic or a phone call full of nothing but attention, and whether that phone call gets made in a hallway where nobody recognizes your face from a segment that ran 11 minutes 2 years earlier. You still haven't told your parents about the offer, not the full shape of it, not the number, not the producer's note about authenticity driving engagement. It's because the telling was never the point. And somewhere around Corinne's decades of never quite bringing it up over coffee, you finally understood why. The decision was never really measuring the $2.1 million at all. It was measuring how much of your life you were willing to let a stranger's recognition occupy. The double take at the pharmacy, the follow-up call that never comes, the low hum of exposure that Nathaniel carries into every ordinary Wednesday, whether or not anyone actually says anything to him that week. You see him sometimes still, at the same coffee shop, and he asks how you're doing in the tone of someone who's stopped assuming anyone's doing especially well, because his own definition of doing well got quietly recalibrated somewhere around the 8th month after the segment aired, when the messages had fully stopped and the mortgage hadn't. You tell him things are fine. They are. It isn't a performance either way. That's the part that's easy to miss from the outside. The absence of the show isn't its own kind of show. It's just Wednesday, still the same as it was standing at the counter with a toaster running its second cycle and an email nobody else would ever read the same way you did. Your mother, once she's fully recovered from the procedure and back to her own kitchen, asks you one evening, almost offhandedly, whether you'd ever consider telling your story publicly someday, the way she's heard other people in similar situations eventually do, once enough time has passed that it feels less raw. You tell her you don't think so, not because the story isn't worth telling, but because the telling was never the part of it that mattered to you in the first place. She nods, the way she nods at most of your decisions these days, and changes the subject to something about the garden, and neither of you mentions the $2.1 million at all because she still doesn't know it ever existed, and there's no version of this particular Tuesday evening where that fact would make either of you happier at the table. And now that so little of that space is occupied in you, now that the 18 minutes on a Sunday and the settlement left quietly invested, and the 4 words typed back to a lawyer 8 months ago have all quietly done their work, what fills the room where the offer used to?